leadership is not so much about the answers. It's more about, are you asking the right questions? That's the first thing I would say. Because, for example, with myself, my job is not to be the most creative in a room, but it is to make sure that the creativity in the room has space to breathe. So I think if there are people struggling with that sort of like, oh, I have to know everything and that's what it means to be a leader. I would genuinely say that sometimes it's more about knowing when to step back.
This podcast is sponsored by Pragmatic Solutions, the player account management platform chosen by today's smart betting and gaming operators. Don't let technical constraints delay you from achieving your business goals. Expand your business, boost your margins, and dominate the market in any leading regulated jurisdiction with our powerful, flexible, and secure iGaming platform. Enjoy its extensive marketing tools, compliance protection, real-time data, and a wide portfolio of over 1,000 industry providers. It's time to upgrade your technology. Let Pragmatic Solutions show you the modern approach. Visit pragmatic.solutions and join the smart thinkers.
This podcast is brought to you by Pragmatic Play, a leading game developer providing player favorites to the most successful brands across the industry. With an award-winning multi-product portfolio of slots, live casino, bingo, virtual sports, and more, Pragmatic Play is powering up new possibilities of play through one single API. Visit pragmaticplay.com and discover your favorite every time.
Bingo, bango, bongo. We have Leah Neutel, head of studio for Real Life Gaming here today. Welcome to the podcast, Leah. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited.
Yes, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here today, Leah. And the backdrop to this episode is we're going to talk a lot about leadership today. And particularly since you are the head of studio at Relax Gaming, you deal with creative teams that has an interesting side to it when it comes to leadership. And you specifically obviously have a very, very interesting background as well as a leader. And so I want to kind of kick off the episode today to talk about your path into leadership. And can you talk a little bit more about your background and then perhaps what made you so interested in leadership overall?
Yeah, I think that leadership has been a constant thread throughout very different chapters of my life. From working with youth offenders, for example, in Sweden, to leading game studios today. So I can say that on the surface, my background and what I do now couldn't be more different in one aspect. But the skills you need in leadership are surprisingly quite similar. This comes to, the aspects like building trust, inspiring people, helping them see a vision of what's possible. One could say that I perhaps didn't start off my career, with the thought to set out to lead in gaming, but I did set out to lead people through complex challenges. So I guess the medium changed, but in another sense, the mission didn't.
Yeah, brilliant. And Leah, just to give a little bit more context, can you talk just a little bit more of the experience that you had previously? You mentioned that you were leading kind of challenged individuals in Sweden, and you had some other interesting experience. Can you talk just a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think that is relevant. I mean, unconventional paths shape unconventional leaders, perhaps. In my background, I worked previously within international development, so both for the UN and for an institution here in Sweden. The work I did earlier on with youth offenders had to do with basically rehabilitating youth who had criminal charges back into society. That's one part of it. And then in Zimbabwe, I worked with diversity and policy initiatives when I lived there. I could say that both those two things demand resilience, empathy, and vision. Those experiences became, I suppose, the foundation of how I lead today, even within gaming or at Relax. I suppose at Relax, where I guide multidisciplinary teams of designers, developers, creatives, and so on to push boundaries is also quite, in that sense, it's kind of the same complex challenges, maybe not in the same context, but it is pushing boundaries in one of the most dynamic industries that we currently have in the world.
Yeah, it's such an interesting background, kind of leading individuals that kind of society has forgotten in the past to then where you are today as the head of studio at Relax Gaming. It gives you perhaps a pretty interesting depth in leadership that is quite unique, I think, especially in our industry. But I want to ask on that point as well. I'm interested to kind of understand principles that have guided you in leadership, and I'm curious to hear from your perspective if there are any like particular pointed principles that you are carrying with you in the leadership style that you have formed.
Yeah, that's actually something I feel quite confident in and quite strongly about when it comes to leadership. I think my early work forced me to lead without authority, and I think that's one of the ultimate tests of real leadership. And I learned a lot from that, So for me, it's resilience, empathy, and vision. Those are my non-negotiables when it comes to leadership. Empathy fuels trust. Trust fuels collaboration, and collaboration fuels innovation, which is something that is incredibly important when leading creative people, when leading within the gaming industry. It sounds simple, I know, in practice, but it means leading with clarity and holding people accountable without fear, always putting the human element at the center of the work. That's also something I believe. I try to lead with clarity, humanity, but also accountability, because this triangle is, I think, what at least keeps me grounded. At scale, especially in the gaming industry, there's constant pressures, whether it be creative differences or deadlines, technical challenges, and so on. But for me, these principles are not abstract, really. They are the compass that I use to keep my teams healthy, motivated, and constantly moving forward, which is a very important part of our work.
Yeah, it's a quite fine line, isn't it, in leadership, where you say, for example, you want to lead with empathy, but you also don't want your staff to be able to do whatever they want at all times, right? And then the same thing opposite is like you want to have some form of authority, but not as much authority that the team feel like they are completely handcuffed. It's like
exactly.
It's a very narrow line, isn't it, between these principles? No?
It's a fine balance between. I think being empathetic or leading with empathy is very much a positive thing to do. It's something I strongly encourage, honestly. But I think with that, accountability is equally as important, and that's both holding members of a team accountable for what's agreed upon, but also yourself, like as a leader, you need to be able to show that, if I was accountable for something that hasn't gone right or that I haven't done or I could have done better, it's important to be open about these things and sort of self-reflect in the same way that you expect from the people who report to you or from your teams. And I think that is also a skill that strengthens trust, right? And I think that when you hold yourself accountable, it's also a lot easier to hold others accountable in a way that they respond in a positive light.
Yeah, exactly. And that's another good point, right? Where it's not only about like how you lead others, but it's also setting the example yourself as well, right? It's difficult for a staff member to respect a leader, perhaps, that is not living up to their own standards, right?
For sure. You have to talk the talk, yourself.
Yeah, definitely. And can you talk a little bit more about like how these principles were shaped by experience, perhaps in more challenging environments, like we talked previously?
Yeah, so that's something I've reflected upon quite a bit over the last years. I think that, like I mentioned before, in my past working within Sweden and Zimbabwe and all of that, it was situations where authority was not necessarily something you could lean on. I think there's a lot of leaders today that, you can lead because at the get-go, people sort of have to listen to you if you're the manager, or if you're, whether they kind of like it or not, right? But I think in both those situations, I needed to lead and motivate without that sort of position at all. Because if you want to go into a room and get a policy changed, or if you want to motivate a youth to believe in a life that they've never envisioned for themselves, this isn't coming from a place of authority. This is coming from a place of motivation, and sort of like a common understanding, and trying to make them see the goal that you envision yourself for them or for the policy, or in my case now for the games that we make. So I think that these experiences that I had before have really taught me to work with people who don't have to follow you, right? So how do you do that? And I think that that's where the real motivation actually comes in. And this kind of angle at leadership works incredibly well with creative people, because in gaming, for example, creative people are far more open to do the best that they can do when feeling inspired or motivated towards a goal than feeling sort of constrained, or feeling sort of directed into a certain position. So from that aspect, I think that there's a lot of lessons learned for me from previous industries that were incredibly beneficial, that I can use, basically today within creative environments.
Yeah, it's a good point if we slide into that topic of leading creative people, because to get the most out of a creative individual, they need to feel free to pursue their creativity, right, without kind of guessing what their manager want or trying to kind of fulfill the wishes of someone else. It's more like when they can be their maximum creative self, like that is where the magic happened. But then at the same time, we slide back to that there still have to be controls and checkpoints in place. So
for sure,
they perhaps don't slide outside of let's say, the creative guidelines of real-life gaming, for example, and so on. Like, what are some of the challenges, would you say, and some of the solutions that you have found then perhaps in leading creative individuals in your studio team successfully?
I would say that when it comes to challenges in that regard, I mean, when people are motivated and feeling passionate about what we're doing, of course, things can go in for very good reasons and for with having good intentions, so to speak. It can go sort of awry. I think at the end of the day, what's the most important there, and that's my job, is to make sure that everyone is aiming in the same direction, right? So the second that something goes sideways or sort of isn't aligned to the end goal, it's quite simple. When a person is trying their best and is giving it their all and cares about the product, having a simple discussion, just sort of realigning, like, this is what we wanted to do, and how is this basically a stepping stone in us getting there? And often with some reflection, that will kind of change on its own, so to speak. In other situations, which I think is also important to mention, is that leadership is a lot about asking the right questions rather than pointing in a direction, right? And sometimes, something might seem array, but it might actually benefit the quality of the end product. Or maybe it's not exactly what we plan to do, but it could be beneficial. Then I would actually say that might be a sort of realignment we need to make within the team. So I think listening is a big part in this, and relying on the capabilities within the team, because they do, they are experts in their fields, whichever section it may be.
I would love to zoom in on that point you made, Leah, of the importance of asking the right questions. And I think perhaps, correct me if you feel I'm wrong, but many young leaders perhaps feel like they have a chip on their shoulders to take the right decision, and, you do that, this person do this, and kind of, steer the ship in the right direction, so to say. But you point out here something really interesting, which is sometimes leadership is a lot about listening, maybe instead of directing. And I think it's a really important point to zoom into a little bit more. So can you talk a little bit more about that importance of listening and asking the right questions?
Yeah. I think that, this sort of reminds me of when it comes to failures, right? Failures in a workplace or failures in a project or what it may be. I think that especially, you can see it when people are sort of just starting off in leadership or something. It's a very difficult thing to deal with, in a sense, because on the one hand, you could say that, a failure is, you could go into it being, who failed, what happened, who did what, right? But there's another aspect. You could go into it looking at from the perspective of, what did we learn, right? And I think if you have that mindset, the same goes for this, what I'm talking about when it comes to listening, because at the end of the day, my role and my skills are within guiding, are within keeping everyone aligned. However, within my team, I do have experts in technology, in art, in, whatever it may be, QA, right? And with all of their expertise, the quality that they can push together is way more than I could ever do alone. So I think that when you understand that, the importance of bringing in their perspectives is crucial. It's not always easy to do. Sometimes the perspective of one department will sort of go against the perspective of another. And then, of course, you need to sort of make a decision that's better for the end product then and there. But I do think that taking in that makes you not only a better leader, but it ensures that their voices are heard, that their expertise are sort of, that they're encouraged to share their perspective rather than, pushed into a corner where they need to just sort of, rinse and repeat and do the same thing every day. It's also motivating for people, if they feel heard, if they can be the pioneer of a change that was for the better, they're likely to come back and feel, be even more buzzing for the project the next day or for the next game or whatever it may be. And as they grow in both confidence and feeling heard, so will the quality, so will innovation, and at the end, so will the end product.
Yeah, so it's a great point, Leah, and if I can build on it a little bit more, I think perhaps young leader often will feel perhaps a little bit insecure coming into the leadership role, and there is perhaps some imposter syndrome involved there, whether they question, should I really be here, and so on. And a reaction to that sometimes is, kind of this overconfidence when they feel like, in order for me to be a leader, I have to be the best at everything, because that's
Exactly.
what it means to be a leader. And there's like a misunderstanding there, perhaps, from individuals that no, it's not about being the best at everything, right? It is maybe sometimes about getting the most out of the people that you have in your team that are the real experts, and ensuring that as a team that you then kind of maximize
100%.
that output, right?
Yeah. I think that, in general, especially in a multidisciplinary team, leadership is less about answers. And I think that that's something that perhaps, when in doubt or when feeling that you have, imposter syndrome or what it may be, I think that that's one of the sort of tricky parts for some people, is that leadership is not so much about the answers. It's more about, are you asking the right questions? That's the first thing I would say. Because, for example, with myself, my job is not to be the most creative in a room. But it is to make sure that the creativity in the room has space to breathe. So I think if there are people struggling with that sort of like, oh, I have to know everything, and that's what it means to be a leader. I would genuinely say that sometimes it's more about knowing when to step back. It's more about guiding than it is about, at the end of the day, ultimately, if you're a leader, you're there to support, right? You're there to sort of steer in the right direction and watch others thrive. So I would say that that's at least in my opinion, a little bit more healthy way of looking at it than feeling that, I have to show, I think as a leader in general, they laugh a lot at the studio because I say this a lot, but, if the team does well, the team does well, right? And if the team fails, I failed. So I would say that if you go into leadership in a very serious way, or if it's something that someone's considering, there isn't much glory as some seem to think. It's quite the opposite, right? Like if things go well, it's because of the team, and if things go badly, it's likely because of you.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe a kind of common thread around what we would consider poor leaders is kind of leading with that insecurity, say, because on the one hand, when you manage your team as kind of an insecure leader, that can come out in this more controlling way where, okay, you do this, you do that in order for you as a leader to feel good that you're directing people. But then above your team, it could come out as, you are taking credit for the work of the team,
Of course.
for example. And I think like many of us have been part of teams where you do really great work and you're excited, you come up with great ideas. And then the manager perhaps isn't giving you that credit because they feel insecure that, the team below them might rise above them, for example, or something like this, right? And
Exactly.
I think it's just important as an employee to remember that this is a sign of insecurity,
Yeah,
if you dig deeper
100%.
into it. Yeah. Is that something you are mindful of, like to say in Relax, another environment, when you educate your leaders, is just that like
For
insecurity point,
sure.
or yeah?
Yeah, I've been a part at Relax as well, but I've been a part of basically training managers who are managers for the first time in various departments and so on. And I think that this is something that we speak about a lot in the beginning, that if someone in your team is, even if you're in the exact same say department, whether it be art or development or whatever, if there is someone in your team who you feel is better than you, that's a good thing. That you should be grateful for that, right? That means that you can learn from that person. It doesn't take away your role, which is, the guiding or the leading or the having the overview or whatever their role might entail. But it's something to not sort of shy away from, right? Because if you let other people grow, you grow with them. It's only a mutually beneficial agreement, right? And support. And I think the healthiest way is to not see sort of teammates or colleagues as competition. I mean, at the end of the day, we all have our individual skills. We all have our little backpacks of whatever it is that we're good at, or, and we're all different. But when used in the right way, that's only something that fuels diversity, that fuels innovation. And, if everyone feels seen and feels that their voices are heard, feels that they're given credit for their ideas, that's also very important, right? It's very demotivating to sort of do something incredible and watch someone else take the credit for your work. That's incredibly demotivating. But I would say that when people enter the room, or especially leaders themselves, are like, this is your expertise. Can you tell me more about that? And, with another department, the same thing. And then make a decision with all of this in mind, based on what these experts have said and this and that, I have now decided this way. Most people respect that, right? Because they see that their expertise were considered to the highest level before making this decision. And I think that that's all it's about, really.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, if you are a leader that lifts others, if you're a leader where people in your team eventually, from time to time, rise above your pay grade, and you support that, and you're behind those team members to maximize their career, that eventually will put you yourself in a position where you're seen as an incredibly strong and valuable leader, right? So
100%.
It's kind of like a short-term versus long-term mindset.
For sure.
Because instead of feeling like a failure because your own employee rose above you, it's like, okay, great, this is an opportunity to show that I'm a supportive leader, so that I position myself as, a strong leader that can rise myself in the future, right? Yep.
100%.
And I'm curious, that also, if we see a little bit deeper, it also means that, as a leader, if I want to create that type of environment in my team, that also needs to be somewhat supported by the culture in the company as well, right? Because I would imagine that there are many organizations where perhaps that is not seen, right? And there is like the kind of backstabbing your way up to the top is a real thing in some organizations, I think. So to that end, how are you thinking about creating that culture in Relax Gaming to support people who do good for others, if that makes sense?
100%. Yeah, I think this is a sort of hot topic throughout the industry in terms of how people get to where they are, and who is heard, who makes it and who doesn't, and all of these things. I do think that one of the main reasons I joined Relax almost 5 years ago now is that this company has a incredibly strong culture. It's very much flat, which is something that I appreciate. It suits my leadership style. It suits the way I like to work and the way I interact with my team. And I think that with that sort of general basis, it's already, I wouldn't say it makes it easier, but it is a perfect breeding ground to accomplish some kind of leadership that can, let people grow and so on and so forth. Because if you walk into a place that isn't, that's a way more authoritative or top down, or, we all know those kind of structures. I think that already there, it's unlikely for employees. Employees tend to be a bit more weary of leadership or managers. They tend to be a bit more, if you ask them to do something, sort of, oh, why? What's the end goal? But the truth is, it's because the trust isn't there. If you have this sort of flat, human to human, like, I'm Leah, this is my role, you're who you are, this is your role, how do we do this together? I think that this approach, it works because of the culture we already have here.
It's a good point. I'm also curious about another point, which is debated left, right, and center around leadership, which is setting boundaries on a personal level. So, kind of like, should you be friends with your staff? Where does those boundaries go? Because on the one hand, you want to show that you're like people that you work with as well, but on the other hand, you gotta be some boundaries there as well, right? Like, so should you be genuine close friends with your employees?
I think it depends very much on who the leader or the manager is as a person, right? We're all different. Some people in general are more private about their lives, and others are kind of more open. I don't think there's a right or wrong in that, but I do think that depending on who you are as a person already will kind of determine if that's possible. I do think it's possible, by the way, to be friends. I do. But it does come with the boundary of, work versus outside. And that needs to be understood on both sides of the friendship or of the relationship, so to speak. I do think it's possible, especially in settings where both have respect for one another in a very sort of equal way. There's an understanding of, this is my role and this is your role, and we want the same thing. In our case, we want to make an incredible game. In fact, we want to make the best game, right? Like that's what's driving us. It's not necessarily like, oh, I'm doing this because my manager told me to. We're here because we want to create something, all of us. So I think that it comes quite natural with our company culture that we're so lucky to have, all of us really, but also with our setup in this sort of flat way. Of course, you should be a little careful because things can go, if sort of private things come back into work and so on, it's not something most leaders are going to enjoy. But I think for the most part, if you're a good judge of character, it might not be everyone, it might be some, but I do think that two adults, can choose to both work together and be friends, should that be what they want.
Yes. And let's discuss conflict resolution a bit as well, because in any team, there'll be a difference in personalities, cultures, different backgrounds and so on. And inevitably in a high-performing, high-octane, high-pace environment, there's going to be some level of conflict, right? And so I want to ask you, like, kind of how your view around conflict resolution is, particularly if you have, let's say, two people in the same team that really doesn't get along or something along those lines, or just in general, your kind of views on conflict resolution.
Yeah, I think conflict resolution is something I've worked with for the most of my career, actually. I think that whether it's in, other industries or in gaming or even within the studio, I think conflict is often seen as a problem, right? Conflict is something that people don't want to have in the workplace, like, oh, we can't have any conflicts. And I think that actually in itself causes a lot of problems, because for me, conflict is not the problem, it's avoidance that's the problem. A resolved conflict should leave the team feeling stronger, not just quieter. So it needs to be handled correctly, because my approach is quite simple. It's about, I try to slow down the emotions and speed up the understanding. This means that I don't shy away from disagreements. Instead, I create a space for people to voice their perspectives. That's important. And then help them, if need be, find a common ground. For example, in my background, in Zimbabwe, I worked in environments where conflict was almost constant, you could say, both, culturally, politically, even on a personal level. But I can't go into details of that line of work, but navigating those spaces, I can say, really taught me that conflict is actually energy. The real skill is redirecting that energy into alignment and growth. It's not a bad thing. It's not something to be afraid of and to sort of, sweep under the carpet and, and never look back. And I think that's exactly how I approach conflict, even here at Relax, by seeing it as a chance to strengthen bonds or clarify direction, rather than something to suppress. Because I think that conflict really only becomes a problem when it's suppressed or when it's sort of avoided, because that is a breeding ground for way bigger problems than whatever the said conflict might be in the moment if addressed.
Yeah, it's a good point, and it's kind of almost like in personal relationship as well, right? Like when there's an argument, usually the outcome and the lesson from the argument, like if you come to a good point, at least, is that you
Yeah,
eventually realize that we were just speaking from two different perspectives. Like there isn't really the
100%.
right and wrong often, and like the goal often in arguments or conflict resolution is just to understand that, like, okay, there's another perspective here than mine. It doesn't mean that there's necessarily a right and wrong, but it's perhaps more about
100%. Yeah.
just getting to that point where you can at least, even if you still think that you're right, at least you can emphasize where the other perspective came from. Like that is kind of like the goal sometimes, right?
100%. I mean, if there's an effort made to understand the other side, that doesn't mean you need to agree with the other side. But the second you can try to understand it,
Yeah, then poof,
that's
it
the
goes away.
first step
Yeah.
to find a common ground. Like, okay, I understand where you're coming from, but this is what I want. How about we do this? I mean, that is legitimately the first step, I would say.
Yeah, that's a good point. And, you know, at Relax, obviously it's a creative company, creative games, and you want to kind of like maximize that creativity. At the same time in the organization, you have everything from game developers on the creative side to lawyers on the orderly side, then if you will, who are to some extent each other's polar opposites. You have different backgrounds with different personalities, different political opinions, and you have basically a melting pot of all cultures and differences that you can possibly think of in the same room. How do you keep cultures and how do you keep these people aligned when there's so much like deep differences between people in the same organization?
I don't think everyone needs to think the same, but I guess I do need everyone to aim in the same direction, right? The diversity here at Relax, I must say, is one of my personal favorite things about this company and about our studio. It's incredibly fueling, I mean, both personally and professionally, to be surrounded by such different people all the time. Obviously, yes, there are some differences, and with that, it takes some consideration. But I think differences are fuel for creativity, right? Alignment is what turns it into progress. So at Relax, I set a very clear North Star for the studio, you could say. And within that, there's room for different voices and perspectives, but we're all aligned on where we're heading. So we don't erase perspectives or differences or whatever we like to call it, but instead we kind of harness them. So practically that means that we're creating clarity around the why, so to speak, of a project, so that people with different expertise or backgrounds or thoughts can all contribute meaningfully, right? Because they're all focused on the same thing. And then that just enriches the entire experience, because the more diverse people are, the more different they are. If they're all from different places or different professions, that means that one goal will be reached in several different ways and in several different layers. So it's an incredibly enriching experience where there's no stone left unturned, if you want to see it from that perspective. So then that way, I guess that the differences of background and personalities and all of these things, in my opinion, are very much an asset rather than a sort of barrier to anything.
You still have, let's say on the political level, the world is heating up in many different parts of the world, and there's very strong opinions that fall into one or the other box at the moment. And I've seen some examples in organizations where kind of political conversation and where do you stand on certain issues become a bit infestated, perhaps sometimes in organizations. And so I want to ask you, like, first and foremost, should companies take stances on political issues in order to kind of align your staff in one direction or the other? Or if you don't, then kind of how do you like, do you allow conversations that are political internally? If this were to start manifesting and it start posing issues internally where people stand on this side of the spectrum, how do you deal with those type of issues? Very, very complicated.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think this is a tricky subject, right? Because while I think that there's no harm in sort of standing behind a cause or so on, it depends what we mean by political, right? At Relax right now, we're currently having a breast cancer awareness campaign, for example, right? That I think is a cause that everyone can stand behind. If it was to turn to something more political in that sense, I think that what's important is that at the end of the day, each and every person that works here throughout the company respects each other. And with that means that you are entitled to have different political opinions or support different political institutions, as long as it doesn't infringe on the respect of another person here. And I think that that's something we do quite well. I'm very sure that, I mean, it's a very big company, you know, way bigger than my studio here, but at the same time, I think that that sort of mutual respect is something that's company wide, which is a very free place to you know, voice opinions. But we're very lucky in the sense that people are supportive of each other because we are so diverse. We're used to having people with different opinions, with different backgrounds, and so it's not really something that's difficult for us to navigate in the terms of, oh, what happens, you know, if this person supports this and I support that. It's not. We kind of come from a place where this sort of difference is almost expected and embraced. As long as there's a common respect for each other, it's not a problem to think differently.
The mission has to come first, right? Like internally,
Exactly.
as an organization, whatever your stance on certain things are, the mission has to come first internally. And if you're a diverse company, it's like if you are a diverse first company where you take the stance that diversity is something good, then it's kind of understood by employees. You would hope that we have to respect people that are of different opinions than myself, right? So that those like aggressive conversations shouldn't take place, because then you aren't really meant to be here in the first place if you don't believe in diversity.
Exactly.
Kind of thing. Yeah.
Exactly.
So I want to switch topic to failure in the workplace as well. Inevitable as well, of course, that even when you support staff members, they are going to be a failure eventually. So how do you support, or rather, how do you deal with failure in the workplace? And as a follow-up question, perhaps, when do you draw the line where failure becomes to the point where, you know, you have to start thinking about letting someone go, for example?
That's a tricky one. In gaming, failure isn't final. It's the prototype for success. So every failure, you could see it as tuition that we pay for learning. The only waste is not using what we've learned. So when a game idea doesn't land, for example, we can treat that as a failure, or we can treat it as iteration data instead of defeat. So my role, for example, here when it comes to these sort of failures is to make sure that the team feels safe enough to take risks and resilient enough to keep moving forward even when things don't go to plan. So instead of focusing on, you know, who did what or what went wrong or, you know, what exactly, who caused this failure, I would say, is not really the angle that we take, but it's more what did we learn, you know? And I think at Relax, that mindset has actually been key to our success. I remember a project where we did push a concept that ultimately didn't resonate, which obviously is, you know, everyone's worst nightmare. But instead of shelving that work, we pulled out the best mechanics, iterated, and turned it into features that strengthened later release. very much so. So I think that's just a good example of what I mean in practice. That's the value of framing failure as iteration. It's no one person. It's no one, it's not a sort of shame experience, but it's a way to transform those setbacks into building blocks instead. And I think that there's a lot to learn and a lot of space to grow. Thank you to failure.
Yeah, it's also a good point. And I was doing a presentation a while ago about kind of turning failure into success. Because in our company, we're an event company. We went through COVID, lost all our business, and as a result of that, we actually became out stronger eventually. So I kind of broke that into principles. And one of the questions I got afterwards was around this, that I realized that a lot of people are carrying with their that they are really afraid to fail.
Yeah.
A lot of people, a lot of employees, staff, professionals are feeling like, if I have a failure, that's the end of the world, right? Whereas a lesson, from running our business for the last 13 years is what took us here today is a constant back and forward. It's like a constant small success, small failure, success, failure,
Yeah.
and then by time you can start kind of go upwards. Failure becomes such a part of the process eventually, right?
Exactly. So I think looking at failure in a way that people are afraid of it or avoid it by all costs, that's not an environment that you want, right? And especially not when you want good quality, when you want to innovate, because there is a level of risk required in order to create something incredible, in order to take the next step. There's always that level of risk. And with that will come failures. But if they're seen as these building blocks, if we take away the lessons learned, I mean, it only makes you stronger. It really does. And it only pushes further. If failure is avoided by all costs, so will progress be, because then you sort of stay where it's safe, right? And it might be a great product, or it might be great what you're doing, but you won't be able to move forward without that risk. And with that risk will come both success, but also failure.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, and if we bring it back to a cultural perspective from an organization, I do think there are a lot of companies, especially when the companies become really, really big, like in the thousands, where you do kind of become some staff, some team become a little bit invisible in the whole context of the organization, and being seen is not necessarily seen as a good thing, right? So it's if I do what I'm told to do, if I keep myself under the radar, I can continue, in this company for the long term. Whereas if I start taking risk and I'm floating up here, that it basically means that I'm risking to lose my title or lose that failure. So the culture of innovation and kind of spurring people on to take risk as a way for the company to stay competitive and to stay up to date is super important, I think, as well, for an organization to constantly spur on this. It's okay to fail, right? If you don't have, we always tell our news team, our editorial team in our business, that if you don't, at the end of the year, if you haven't written a story that has pissed someone off, then we are not being, we don't have enough courage, let's say, in this team. So
I love that, yeah.
Even though it sucks when it happens, but it's just part of the process if you want to stay ahead, right? So it's really important, I think, as an organization to really motivate people that it's okay to fail. Otherwise, you're not being.
Staying safe it will create something constant, but it doesn't create growth.
Right.
It will just be the same thing every day. So I think that failure is something that, at least here, anyways, we don't really see. As I said, we see it as a iteration, as a lesson learned. But I think as long as everyone understands that and feels safe, then it is something that could be used to the benefit of the company, and not something to be too afraid of.
For sure. I mean, and especially in the game production space, which you guys are in, it's if you create another Egyptian themed slot, if you only do that, an Aztec themed slot, it's probably not going to move the needle. But what if you bring massive creativity out? Sometimes you do fail, but then at some point you'll have that big hit, right? And that's what
Exactly.
looking for. Yeah.
Exactly.
So looking ahead now, Leah, what do you see as the most important qualities for leaders in creative futures? If you think about the years that we have ahead of ourselves now, like what qualities will be the most important in these creative roles?
Curiosity will be more valuable than certainty, is what I think. I think the next
I love that.
decade will. I think the next decade will belong to leaders who can hold both creativity and clarity at the same time. The leaders who thrive will be the ones who ask new questions, I think, adapt quickly, and like we discussed a little bit before, but balance creativity with accountability. I think this is incredibly important and will be even more so as we move forward, because the pace of change in creative industries is only accelerating. So the further on we go, the more important I would say that this becomes.
Brilliant. And final question for you here today, Leah, is can anyone be a successful leader? Or are some people just born as leaders and others should just not consider a leadership position? Or do you
That's a
think
good
anyone can
one.
become a leader?
That's a good one. I believe the answer is yes, but only if they're willing to cultivate, empathy, curiosity, and resilience. I don't think those things are negotiable. They're just not optional, in my opinion, anymore. They are essential for guiding, especially creative teams, through the uncertainty that defines our industries. But I think if the will is there and the understanding is there, then I think absolutely anyone can become a leader.
Brilliant. This has been an absolute masterclass in the course of leadership. I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts and ideas, Leah, with us today. And I wish you all the best of luck in the future, guiding your creative teams to success.
Thank you so much. This has been incredible, and I loved having this conversation, and it's a topic close to my heart. So thank you very much.
That was it. Thank you, Leah.